yourself, a 5-part DVD series, and today's lecture is called Dealing with Crisis, Overcoming Disaster. There is a legend that the Nazis set up a museum in Prague in Czechoslovakia, which was to be a museum to mark a vanished race, the Jewish race. And of course the ugly irony was that they would be guaranteeing that the Jewish people would become a vanished race. And in that museum were gathered 1,800 Torah scrolls. After the war, and in 1964, the Jewish community in London were able to purchase 1,564 Torah scrolls which had survived, and they were brought to London in the hope that some could be saved and repaired and sent to Jewish communities all over the world. And here in the background you can see the remaining 150 Torah scrolls that still remain, that couldn't be rescued, and stand as a monument to this sad, tragic story. You know, my wife, who comes from California, has a favourite song, and it's called "The Place Where I Belong." And the song and the lyric of the song tells the story of a Torah scroll. The Torah itself does the talking about being written and how it was cherished and how it was precious and how the Jewish community loved it. And then eventually it was bought and taken to America, where it sits on a shelf in a museum. And the Torah scroll cries because it wants to go to the place where it belongs, where the Jewish people still are, where they will value its message, where they'll read from it the way that they always did. It's a sad ending to the song, but not a sad ending to the ambition of the song. Because despite all of these scrolls behind me that can no longer service vibrant, alive Jewish communities, there are thousands of such vibrant, alive Jewish communities. The Jewish people, amazingly, uniquely, have weathered and survived the storms of the Crusades and the pogroms and the Inquisitions and even the Holocaust. There is an amazing resilience within the Jewish people to overcome the most difficult times, the most appalling situations that they've found themselves in. And once again, the Jewish people are alive and vibrant, and all over the world, Torah scrolls, not on shelves, but in an Aron HaKodesh, are being taken out 3 times a week, read from, the message valued and lived by a living people. And here is one of those very Torah scrolls that the song spoke about. And you can almost hear the tears as it sits on the shelf, pining to be taken back to a synagogue, the place where it belonged. And it's an amazing thing that the Torah Scrolls Trust has done in linking dead Jewish communities from the past, where their Torah scrolls had no life, and bringing them and linking them to vibrant, alive Jewish communities today, where they're going to be restored and rolled out on a bima and read from, brought back to life again. The Jewish people have an amazing capacity to overcome crisis and deal with disaster. And that's what's happened here in London from all those scrolls now brought back to life.
I was made way back in 1842 by a humble man, a real God-fearing Jew, who did his work with honesty, feeling and with pride. He was known in Kiev as Yankele the Scribe. But the hatred from the west came to Kiev, and they rounded up the Jews who had not fled. But Moishele the Shames, he was brave and he was bold. He hid me in his cellar, dark and cold. And for years and years I waited all alone for the people of my town to take me home. And they'd sing and dance and hold me high when they carried me away to my little wooden shul where I would stay. But it was someone else who found my hiding place, and to America he sent me in a crate. And the men who took me off the boat, they said I was a prize, but they were Jews I did not recognize. And in a case of glass they put me on display, where visitors would look at me and say, how very nice, how beautiful, a stunning work of art. But they knew not what was inside my heart. So if you hear my voice, why don't you come along and take me to the place where I belong, and maybe even sing and dance when you carry me away to some little wooden shul where I could stay. And as the rabbi holds me close against his chest, he'll speak out loud and clear to all the rest. He'll say, no matter if you're very young or even if you're old, live by the words you'll find inside this scroll. Live by the words you'll find inside my soul.
I've never ever come across anyone who's not had some moment in their life where they haven't had to face exactly the sort of issue that we are talking about. In fact, in the one occasion that I met a young man who had absolutely everything going for him, perfect parents, perfect siblings, gone to fabulous schools with really understanding teachers, was a very rich young man with trust funds set up by his parents, which meant he would never have to worry about money in his entire life. He came to see me because that situation itself had caused him all sorts of problems. Life was too easy for him. As a consequence of that, he found himself in trouble. So generally, if you did come across one person or any people who've had really trouble-free lives, I would generally imagine that they go on to make a mess of their own lives or get themselves into trouble. So how to get out of trouble? That's the big issue. In Pirkei Avot, our classic collection of Jewish wisdom, all the way back from Mount Sinai, 2,000 years ago, somebody called Ben Bagbag, at the end of the 5th chapter, says, Hafoch bo v'hafoch bo d'kol bo. Turn the Torah over, and turn the Torah over again, because everything's in it. And if so, how to deal with crisis and how to overcome disaster, our subject should be there as well. 20 years ago, I was invited by an organisation called the JLE, based in London, the Jewish Learning Exchange, to be part of their summer tour when they were taking 40 young men to the State of Israel. Now, like most Orthodox Jews, I'd been to Israel numerous times, but what Israel meant for me was getting off the plane at Tel Aviv and going to either Bnei Brak or Jerusalem, and that was it. You've been to Israel. Israel, of course, is much more than just Bnei Brak or Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. In fact, at the times of the Talmud, when Ben Bagbag was speaking, whom I mentioned before, the majority of Jews lived in the north of Israel, and I'd never seen the north of Israel. So I was keen to be part of this tour with these 30, 40 young men, discovering the entirety of what Israel, the land of Israel, is. So we went on the tour. Now, you will know from your own experience that if you're going to have a successful tour, there's one essential ingredient you need, and that's a guide. You need a good guide. And we have the most fabulous guide. His name is Chaim Sidor. And he's one of these fellows who knows every single pebble, every single stone of Israel inside out. And we went to Sfas in the north, Israel's mystical city. And eventually, we found ourselves in a town which had recently been excavated called Tzipori. Tzipori is where the Mishnah was actually redacted, written down. And when we were there, I commented to the head of the JLE in London, Rabbi Danny Kirsch, a very close friend of mine, how wonderful our guide was, how he was able to illuminate every single place that we were with a story which matched and fitted perfectly. And I was really, really impressed with his stories. And he said to me, that's nothing. Get him to tell you his own story. I said, what's his own story? And my friend Rabbi Kirsch said, no, you get him to tell you his own story. And so as we walked from place to place, I started to fall into step alongside Chaim, and I said, Chaim, I hear you've got an interesting story yourself. And he said to me, nah, it's no big deal. I said, Chaim, come on, tell me the story. He said, it's nothing. And then he would go into his next explanation on the tour, and as we moved off, I would accompany him again, and once more ask him to tell me the story. And again he refused. And this happened several times, till it came to lunchtime. We all sat down on rocks, sandwiches were broken out, and I said to Chaim, come on Chaim, tell me the story. And he said, it's nothing. I said, Chaim, I'm a rabbi. My business is stories. You've no right to keep this from me. So he hesitated. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll buy you a beer and you'll tell me the story. He said, I don't like beer. I said, fine, I'll buy you a Pepsi and I'll drink the beer and then you'll tell me the story. So he eventually gave in and relinquished. And he told me his story. He was born in New York. And when he was in New York, he went to university, got a very good degree, which of course gave his parents pride, that old-fashioned Yiddish word, nachas. And then after getting a letters LLB after his name, he then put other letters after his name, which gave his parents even greater pride and nachas. And those letters you may be familiar with, IFB, which stands for in the family business. So he moved into the family business, and they had a number of stores that were open throughout New York City 24/7. He was given the managership of one of these stores. And I'm going to tell you this story exactly as he told it to me. He said, I should have did the message the second time I was looking down the barrel of a gun. The second time I was looking down the barrel of a gun. He'd be in the store late at night, and then two black guys came into the store. They stuck a gun in his face, and they demanded that he handed over the contents of the cash register, which he very wisely did. Then, again, this happened. And then one night, two white guys, and he knew these guys, came into the store, and by some trick, I must admit, I can't remember the details of the trick, they managed to get him into the cellar, into the basement of the store. And there they attacked him with knives. They slashed him 37 times. They stabbed him 16 times, managing to miss every vital organ except his lungs. They pierced both his lungs. Somehow he fought his way into a downstairs restroom, and he bolted the door, and they were trying to break down the door, but he had a shoulder to it and they weren't able to. And then it went quiet outside, and he collapsed onto the toilet seat. And again, telling you the story as he told it to me, he knew he was going to die. So he took this finger and he put it in the blood that was spurting from his chest. And in his own blood, he started to write the names of the two people who had stabbed him on the wall. At least the police should catch them. But somehow, he had heard, although he comes from a completely non-religious background, that a Jew should, if a Jew can, say Shema, the classic Shema prayer, before they die. And so, sitting there in a toilet seat, he said Shema. Probably, I would guess, Chaim only knew the first line, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, but he said it. Still outside it was quiet, and he knew he had no chance if he stayed where he was. So he plucked up his courage, And he pulled back the bolt and opened the door, and his two assailants had gone, had fled the scene. So he staggered across the basement floor to the emergency fire door that he had been unable to open when they were attacking him, and this time somehow got it open. He staggered one block down to where there was an all-night cinema, a movie house, and he went into the foyer and collapsed on the floor. The ticket lady came rushing out, and he whispered his name and his father's phone number. She dialed 911, and an ambulance arrived and swept him away to the nearest hospital. Now, of course, it's a different system of healthcare in the United States than it is to the United Kingdom, and he was taken to the nearest hospital, which was a public hospital. The details, I must admit, as a Scotsman, I'm not quite au fait with, but he told me it wasn't such a nice place, and that's putting it mildly. When he arrived in the emergency room, he was examined by a doctor who declared there was nothing he could do to help him, and he was left on the gurney to die. The police were delighted, because apparently in New York state law, the statement of a dying man is irrefutable in court. And so they took his statement, somehow he scribbled his signature, and the police left. Then his father arrived. The father had actually phoned the hospital, had spoken to the doctor who had examined his son, and was told by that doctor, "I'm sorry, Mr. Sidor, your son is dead." When he arrived with the local rabbi to collect the body of his son, in actual fact he discovered his son was not dead. Nearly dead, but not dead. And so, and again I'm telling the story exactly as he told it to me, he and the rabbi ran around the hospital, and after half an hour managed to find two junior Jewish doctors who were willing to take on the case. And they fought for 9 hours and saved his life. Well, they told him it would take him 6 months to be able to get out of this hospital. He was so weak, he'd been so badly assaulted. However, as it was such a horrible place, he wanted to get out as soon as he could. And of course, you can discharge yourself from any hospital, but New York state law states that you have to be able to sign the discharge papers, and you have to be able to stand up when you do so. So, somehow or other, after 2 weeks, he struggled to his feet, he signed the discharge forms, and he left that place. Well, when he got home, indeed it took him 6 months to recuperate and to recover sufficiently to be able to live a normal life. And when he was so recovered, he wanted to get out of New York. New York had such terrible and horrible memories for him, he didn't want to stay there any longer. So he went around America, moving from state to state, getting little jobs, temporary jobs, from place to place. He ended up in Las Vegas for a while. He was a croupier, dealing cards at a card table. Then eventually, he came to a place in Oklahoma. I honestly can't remember the name of the town. It was White something or other. But he said it was white by name and white by nature. When he arrived, he became the third Jew in this town. There were almost no blacks living in the town at all. And he said it was a lovely place. This was small town America. It was about as different to New York as you can possibly imagine. And he settled in there quite nicely. Then he saw one day that the nearby university campus, the Black Student Caucus, had issued an invitation to a well-known black civil rights activist of those days by the name of Stokely Carmichael. And Stokely Carmichael, a friend of Malcolm X's, was well known. The liberal left adored him. And the black students were very keen to have their hero come and address the university. The university, very keen to establish its credentials as a tolerant, liberal, white university, okayed the invitation. And when my friend heard about it, he wanted to hear this hero of civil rights, this anti-racist champion, too. So he and one of his Jewish friends went along to the auditorium of the university, and of course we're talking an American university, a huge auditorium, thousands and thousands of people there. There was a stage. On the stage was the vice-chancellor of the university, all the senior lecturers, the professors. The black students were sitting in the front, several rows at the front. They were swelling with pride. And sitting to the left of the stage, Mr. Stokely Carmichael and his entourage. And so the head of the university approached the lectern, tapped the microphone, made sure it was working. Everybody fell silent, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege for us today to have with us Mr. Stokely Carmichael. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Stokely Carmichael. And everybody stood up, and there was a huge noise, thunder of applause, a standing ovation. My friend Chaim and his Jewish friend clapping their hands together with everybody else. And eventually the audience fell silent, and Stokely Carmichael put his hands on the lectern and began his lecture. The problem with America today is the Jews. The Jews have too much money. The Jews have too much power. The Jews control the banks. And my friend Chaim said that he sat there stunned at this massive spewing forth of racist hatred from the hero of the left, the great champion of anti-racist activism, pouring forth anti-Semitism. And he turned to see the reaction of the tolerant liberal whites. To a man, they got to their feet and burst into applause. And after that, my friend Chaim said he felt that America was no longer the place for him. And so he flew back to New York. And when he got to New York, he decided from there he wants to get out and go and live in Israel. Now, we're talking in the 70s, the late 70s. If you wanted to go in the 70s and live in Israel, I mean settle, be there permanently, tomorrow, where would you go? Well, to a kibbutz, of course. And so he went to the kibbutz office in New York, and he was interviewed by somebody, and the guy said to him at the end, Chaim, no problem. You want to go to Israel? Chaim, book the next flight to Tel Aviv from JFK. Chaim, go home. And Chaim said to him, won't I need any references? Chaim, you don't need no references. Just book the next flight and go home. So he stayed in the hotel at JFK, and the next day he gets on a flight and he arrives at Tel Aviv and he stays in the hotel there. And the next day he went to the kibbutz office in Tel Aviv. And he was interviewed, and at the end of the interview the guy said, and where's your references? He said, your colleague in New York said I wouldn't need any references. And so he responded the way that Israelis typically respond when they're faced with such a circumstance or situation. He went, and Chaim was stuck. Well, what happened was he had gumption. He had backbone, Chaim. And he'd been to Israel before. He knew of some kibbutzim, and he simply decided to get in a taxi and go to the front door of some kibbutzim. He knocked on the door. He asked for an appointment. He wanted to join the kibbutz. And he was asked, and where's your references? I don't have any references. And he met more shouldering. But he had an aunt, a distant aunt living in Israel. Now, if you know anything about Israeli society, you'll know there is an absolutely essential ingredient that you need in order to succeed in Israel. And that ingredient is called vitamin P. That means protectia. You need somebody in the inside, working on your behalf. You need a little bit of leverage. And this aunt had connections with a certain kibbutz. Now, I don't know if you know very much about the kibbutz movement, but it's very broad. At one side of the spectrum, you've got kibbutz hadati, religious kibbutzim. They keep all the laws that are pertinent to growing food in the land of Israel. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got kibbutz anti-dati, anti-religious kibbutzim. And his aunt had connections and contacts with people on this sort of kibbutz. She picked up the phone, she made the appointment, and off he went. He was interviewed. This time he was interviewed successfully. It included handwriting analysis, psychological evaluation, but he passed. They accepted him as a probationary member, and he was in. After 6 months, he got his call-up papers. He joined the Israeli army. And now the horrible memories of what happened to him in New York were fading fast. He's got a new country. He's got a new language. He's even got a new uniform. He looks different. And then it came to Yom Kippur, the holiest day in our calendar. The Israeli army tries to allow as many of its soldiers as possible to go home when it comes to Yom Kippur. And he was one who was allowed to go home to his new family in this kibbutz. When he arrived home on this kibbutz, he discovered that Yom Kippur is a special Chag, a special festival on this kibbutz. It's the festival of Basar Levan, the cottage cheese. Pork and cottage cheese. As Chaim explained it to me, the great-grandparents of the current generation living there, they, coming from Russia, socialists and communists, this was their statement of what they thought of God. Yom Kippur, we're going to eat pork and cheese together. Take that! But Chaim said that the current generation, lovely people, good people, he said it was so sad because they didn't know why they were eating pork and cottage cheese on Yom Kippur. Because they didn't know what Yom Kippur was. And Chaim said, when I saw that, I thought to myself, all the things that happened to me, I don't know why they happened to me. But one thing I know for certain, I didn't go through all of that and come all this way to give it up and become a non-Jew. And that first thought started him on a journey in which he ended up in an apartment in Jerusalem, which was going to grow into a yeshiva called Or Sameach one day. A friend of his had gone there, was trying to persuade him to come and spend a Shabbat. He was refusing, but after this, he decided to go, and he liked it. And he stayed there for 6 months. He went AWOL from the Israeli army. When he came back to the base 6 months later, he's wearing one of these, and he's got tzitzis out. They looked at him and gave him a dishonorable discharge, and he settled in the north of Israel. If you get a chance to go to the north of Israel, he's well worth seeking out. He is a brilliant tour guide. But probably the most important thing he said was, I don't know why the things happened to me that did happen to me. That's the classic question. When something goes wrong in our lives, when we face a crisis, when we face a disaster, we want to know, why me? Why did these things happen to me? It's not only how we feel. Judaism says it's a perfectly legitimate approach to adopt. Did I do anything wrong? Was it my fault? Did I make this happen? And believe it or not, that approach, even Moses was naturally inclined towards. Do you remember that story? It's in the Chumash. It's the story of Moses sent by God to tell Pharaoh to let the Jewish people go. And if you remember, when he confronts Pharaoh and he throws down his stick, which miraculously turns into a snake, Pharaoh's not even a little bit impressed. Instead of liberating the Jews, he turns up the heat in their slavery. Things get much worse. And Moses returns to God. And this is what he says. But Yoshev Moshe El Hashem. Moses returns by Yomar. And he says, Adonai, Lama hari isla amazeh, lama zashalchtani. My God, why did you send me? Why have things got worse for the Jewish people? And then he says, from the moment I came to Pharaoh, to speak in your name, things got worse for the Jewish people, and you haven't saved them. Why? Here is the classic human response to crisis and disaster. Why? Here's God's response. Vayam Hashem and Moshe. And Hashem and the Almighty says to Moshe, Atatira. Now you'll see Asher Esel Para, what I'm going to do to Pharaoh. The human reaction is, why? And we want the answer, no. And God's response is, again, to take a leaf out of Israeli society, wait and see. And sometimes waiting and seeing can take a long time. In the UK, where I live, 9 months of the year, there are many, many Jews who owe their existence to a story which inevitably would have provoked a why. And it took 50 years before an answer came. I don't know if you're aware, but during the lead up to the Second World War, there was almost as much anti-Semitism in the UK as there was in Germany. The famous George Orwell, the author of 1984 and Animal Farm, wrote a famous essay on British anti-Semitism. And he pointed out that the many thousands of people who fled Nazi Europe from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and found refuge in the shores of the UK, were these refugees enjoyed or were given a nickname by the indigenous population, not refugees, refugees. And Britain incidentally only allowed refugees in if they had a skill which the country could actually use. It wasn't a philanthropic exercise. Well, when war, in fact I should tell you that I had a relation who was exactly like that, a German Jew. He got himself taught the rudiments of carpentry, although really he was a travelling salesman, so he could pretend to be a carpenter. He got in, he was interred in a camp in the south coast of England called the Kitchener Camp, and there eventually he managed to secure British nationality, and he was in the Foreign Office in London filling in the forms for his wife and his 6-year-old son to join them when England, the day that England declared war on Germany, and he never saw them ever again. Well, what happened was that when war was declared, Britain found that it had many, many foreign and enemy aliens now residing amongst its population. Now, they knew that these people were Jews, but still they were German passport holders or Austrian passport holders. They were enemy aliens. And they didn't know what to do with them, so they were all arrested and shipped to an island off the west coast of Liverpool called the Isle of Man, where they were temporarily held in detention. But as it was only a temporary measure, the question was what to do with them in the long term. And so the minds in London, trying to find a solution, came up with the traditional, the historic British solution to what to do with people you don't want, which is, of course, to send them to Australia. The next problem was finding a vessel that they could actually take them to Australia on. Because if you remember the history of that time, when Britain stood alone against Germany, it was only able to survive due to the largesse of the American people and government who sent ships and convoys to give them the badly needed supplies. The Germans' tactics was to deploy wolf packs, as they were called, of U-boats who patrolled the Atlantic trying to sink as much shipping as possible. So there was a vast shortage of boats. They found one, however. It's called the Dunera. The next problem was finding sailors who would be able to man the ship and sail it to Australia, because if ships were being lost, so too were merchant sailors. And somebody in the Foreign Office or the Home Office in England had a brilliant idea. Let's go to the prisons, let's go to the jails, and we will find there surely various sailors who've been arrested, sometimes for very serious crimes, and offer them a pardon, an amnesty, if they volunteer to crew this ship and take it to Australia. Well, unsurprisingly, they very soon got themselves a crew. The Jews were moved to the south coast of England, to one of the ports, loaded onto this ship called the Dunera, and they set sail for Australia. And 2 days into the voyage, the crew rioted. Well, after all, they were criminals. They grabbed the Jews, these poor survivors, these refugees, and they beat them. They tore the watches from their wrists, the jewels from their fingers. Anybody who resisted was badly beaten. Their luggage, their last remaining possession, was ransacked. Anything that the sailors wanted to keep for themselves, they did. The rest was thrown overboard. And eventually, they arrived in Australia. I want you to imagine yourself getting off a gangplank of a ship in Australia. And I want to imagine how you would feel. Can't you hear yourself saying, Lama hari oisala amaze? Why have you done evil to this people? The exact same words that Moses said to God. You've lost everything. You lost your country. You lost your city. You lost your home. For some of them, they lost their husbands, their wives, and even their children. And then this last indignity. My watch, the watch that was my grandfather's. I had to lose that as well. I had my nose broken. Lama hari oisala amaze. That's the human response. And God says, wait and see. The waiting to see took 50 years. In Amsterdam, there was a non-Jewish fellow who was going through a flea market, and he came to a stall on which he found a collection of second-hand books. He was going through the books, and when he was looking, he found an old, battered, leather-bound volume, which turned out to be a diary, and in fact the diary of a captain of a U-boat, a German submarine. He read through it, was intrigued, and bought this. Eventually it was translated, which is how I'm able to bring you the story. Of course, being the captain of a German submarine, everything was meticulously recorded. And indeed, in one of the pages, He recorded one day how he was patrolling off the English Channel. He put his periscope up, and there, almost directly in front of him, was a merchant ship with a British flag, and the ship he recorded was called the Dunera. He rotated his periscope through 360 degrees to make sure there were no other ships, battleships, accompanying it, protecting it, and found that it was completely alone, an easy, vulnerable, juicy target. And so he changed the angle of the submarine to be facing towards the ship, and he shouted, "Launch a torpedo, fire!" And the torpedo shot through the water, and then, of course, you may have seen this in films or in documentaries, they put the periscope down because the wake of the periscope cutting through the water could be spotted by a plane flying overhead. And then they simply time. They've calculated using trigonometry how long it should take for the torpedo to impact with the target, and they just wait for the bang. So they're looking at the watch, waiting for the bang. There was no bang. So they put the periscope up again, and they could see the wake of the torpedo just missing the boat by feet. The boat was travelling on, but off its stern, just where the rudder was, there was this white movement where the torpedo had missed. That's okay. The captain changed the angle of the torpedo, was about to shout fire again, when something caught his eye which completely baffled him. Because floating on the waves was all sorts of flotsam and jetsam, all sorts of debris, the sort of stuff he normally saw after he'd sunk a ship, but he knew he hadn't sunk a ship. There was the ship sailing away. So he was perplexed by this. He ordered the U-boat to the surface, and some of the sailors grabbed some of these cases bobbing up and down in the waves, and they were taken down below, and the captain opened these suitcases, and when he looked inside, he said, "My God, my God." Because you see, German Jews read German books, Goethe, Kant, Schiller, and all the rest. And some of these suitcases were full of books. The sailors weren't interested in German books, they'd thrown them overboard. But the captain, seeing this, concluded that this ship was full of German prisoners of war who the British were taking to Australia to be put in prison camps. He radioed his discovery to the German Admiralty in Bremerhaven and received instructions to follow the Dunera on its journey, escorting it on the way, signalling to other Italian or Japanese submarines not to attack. It's full of German POWs. But imagine if you were one of those Jews getting off the gangplank. German spies were waiting. They were waiting to see how many German POWs were coming off the ship. To discover it wasn't German soldiers, it was German Jews. So they radioed the results of their discovery back to the German Admiralty, who sent new instructions. The cruel and vicious crew who'd beaten up the Jews were given a week's shore leave while the ship was refueled and supplies were loaded on board. And a week later, they got back on board and turned their ship round to come back to England. And just outside Australian territorial waters, there was a German U-boat waiting for them, who launched torpedoes which this time did not miss. Our reaction? Why? Hashem's reaction? Wait and see. When we're in trouble, when we're in pain, we want the answer, we want the solution now. But sometimes, God says, wait and see. And I remember when I was once myself in Amsterdam speaking at a wedding and then at a school. At the wedding, when I arrived, I was sitting at a rabbi's table, and a young man came in whom I hadn't seen for, must have been 15 years. We were in yeshiva in Gateshead, in the northeast of England, Europe's Oxbridge of Orthodox Judaism, together. And I hadn't seen him for a long time. Let's call him Chaim, which is quite appropriate because he was called Chaim. And he said to me, "How are you?" And I said, "Fine, how are you? What are you doing?" And after we finished the small talk, he said, "I've got big complaints against Gateshead Yeshiva, where we both studied." I said, "What?" And he said, "Why didn't they prepare us for what comes after Yeshiva?" I said, "What do you mean?" So he'd gone to study in a kollel. After Yeshiva, if you're any good, you can perhaps get accepted to a kollel and go on to do post-rabbinic studies. I did so in Liverpool, and he'd done so in Amsterdam. He thought it was a noble enterprise, because not only are the young men, the young rabbis, studying for themselves, but also teaching people, voluntarily teaching people within the community. It's a resource, and he thought people would applaud and salute this nice thing he was doing. But when he arrived there, he found that not everybody did. Not even everybody religious did. Not even all the rabbis did. And he said, why didn't they prepare us for what comes after Gateshead, after yeshiva? Because if you consider it, any young man or any young woman who goes to yeshiva or a religious girls' seminary is going to be for 2 or maybe 3 years part of a body of people who are trying their very best to be the very best that they possibly can be. And therefore, in all probability, you'll never be in a comparable group of people ever again in your life. Everybody's trying to be good, and therefore it's a good place to be. But when you leave, then the world is not quite so wonderful. Not everybody is trying to be good, and not everybody is nice. And this was his discovery. Why didn't they prepare, he said. Why didn't they prepare us for what comes next? And it was heartfelt. I said to him, Chaim, you know, I had the exact same experience as you. I went to Liverpool, the Beatles. There was a kollel there as well. I went to Liverpool when I left Gateshead, and I thought, you know, I'm going to go there, I'm going to be very successful, and everybody will love me. And I went there, and thank God I had success, and some people hated me for it. And I thought just like you for a few moments. And then I said to myself, why? When you were in yeshiva those 7 and a bit years in Gateshead, did you never even once go to a shiur, study in a class this book, the Chumash, the Torah? Did you never once listen to a lecture? Think about Abraham. Did Abraham have an easy life? Avram Avinu, the first Jew? No, I don't think so. When your father informs on you to the secret police, and they put you in a prison for 10 years, and then they're going to burn you alive for your heretical insistence that there are no gods except the one God, that might be tough. How about Isaac? Well, Isaac's father, Abram, is told by God to take him and cut his throat and burn his body to a crisp. Sociologists might even argue he came from a dysfunctional family. No, that wasn't very easy either. And certainly Sarah and Rivka, the wives, they had tough backgrounds. But what about Yaakov? Yaakov? His life was very, very interesting. Well, he's got a twin brother. The twin brother is fighting with him in the womb. And when they're born, there's again conflict between the twin brothers. Esau, Yaakov's brother, says to him, sell me, or I'll sell you, my birthright if you give me that soup. And he does, and that's a nice, fair exchange, and it's his proposal, but then he regrets it and hates his brother for it. And then Yaakov's natural character trait, as we're told, is truth and honesty. But his mother makes him, because she's a prophetess, his mother makes him do something which goes against his nature. Dress up, pretend you are your brother, and steal his blessing. Now, he doesn't want to do this, but if a prophetess tells you to do it, it's from God, so he has to do it, and he does it. The consequence of this is his brother wants to kill him again. He has to flee his brother, and his parents give him a blessing. Run from your brother and go and get the girl who is fated to be your wife. The perfect girl for you. And we'll tell you just the family you'll find her in. And he goes, but his brother sends somebody after him, and he nearly gets killed again. He escapes, and eventually he finds that girl. The perfect girl. Rachel. Will you marry me? She will marry. But my father is a swindler and a cheat. He'll make sure it doesn't happen. Yaakov's confident that he can overcome this. But he couldn't. And so he wakes up after the wedding night, and he can hear his wife in the kitchen, and in she comes carrying the tray of the cornflakes, and there he goes, ah! And hides underneath the down comforter, and then peeks out. What are you doing here? I'm your wife, says Leah. No, Rachel's my wife. No, I'm your wife. And eventually he works another 7 years and gets Rachel as well. But 2 wives also means he gets the father-in-law from hell who cheats him 1,000 times and makes his life a complete and total misery. And then eventually he flees and goes back to the land of Israel. Oh, but his father-in-law comes in pursuit and tries to kill him again. But he escapes. They get to the land of Israel and everything settles down except his daughter gets kidnapped and raped. And his two sons go and slaughter the entire inhabitants of the city of Shechem, where the fellow came from, which doesn't please Yaakov, even though they deserved to die because they were all engaged in this sort of behaviour. They did it in anger. So that turns it from an execution into a murder. So at last, land of Israel, everything's fine. But Joseph, the apple of his eye, his favourite son, is either kidnapped or murdered and certainly isn't there anymore. He loses prophecy. And that's it. His life is blighted. Until the last 17 years of his life. And then he discovers that Joseph's alive, everybody knows the story, he's the king of Egypt, and the whole family is reconciled. They get back together again. So, listen very carefully to this. This is the verse. It's the very last bit of Genesis or Bereshit, and it says, Vahi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim. After the discovery of Joseph, after the family come together, Vahi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim sheva esar shana. And Yaakov was in Egypt for 17 years. Vahi yimei Yaakov, and the days of Yaakov's life, Shnei chayav, the years of his life, was sheva shanim, 7 years. But arboim u'mas shana, 147 years altogether. So, somebody called Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, the great leader, the great doyen of German rabbis and German Orthodoxy, he asks an interesting question. And I'm going to ask you that question as well. Tell me, which part of Yaakov's life was the best part? The first 130 years that I've just described to you, or the last 17 years, where he discovers Joseph, the king of Egypt. When Joseph has set aside an area of Egypt, in England, the gold is green, in America, a borough park, a Jewish area which has got everything they need, yeshivas and kosher food, everything, schools, everything you need. And he gets his prophecy back. So which was the best part of Yaakov's life? The first 130 years or the last 17 years? Now, I know that rabbis always ask trick questions, so you're probably hesitating, but this isn't a trick question. So, which was the best part of his life? And the answer is obvious. The last 17 years of his life. But in which part of his life did he achieve greatness? In which part of his life did he achieve such greatness that God says, the name which I gave you before Yaakov is no longer sufficient. I need to give you a new name. A name that designates you as a greater person. You're going to be called Yisrael in the first 130 years of his life. And I said to my friend, I thought the same as you. But did I never look at the Chumash? Did I never read the story? Remember Ben Bagbag? Hafoch ba, hafoch ba, dekanabo. Turn the Torah over and turn the Torah over again because everything's in it. See, the problem was I did go to those shiurim. I did hear these lectures. I know these stories. But I thought they were stories. It never occurred to me that the story of Avram and his conflicts and his crisis and the disasters in his life, the story of Yitzchak and Yaakov and their wives, weren't stories. They were a blueprint. They were the DNA of me, of one of their children, thousands of years later. How they dealt with crisis is how I should deal with crisis. And that's what I said to my friend. Did you never go to a Chumash shiur? What made you think the world was all rosy? The world is full of conflict and crisis. But if you succeed, if you achieve, if you conquer them, then greatness lies on the other side. It would be nice to have just the 17 years. No. But when did greatness come to Yaakov? When did he achieve greatness? In the tough times. Very often when we go through tough times, we discover within ourselves greatness we didn't know existed. We achieve where we never thought we could achieve before. I'm going to tell you something which I heard from somebody called Rubinstein who incidentally is one of my, I would say heroes, but I suppose heroines, probably the most brilliant female mind I know. And Rubinstein quotes the Rambam in Moreh HaNevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed. The Rambam talks about 4 levels of suffering. The first level of suffering is somebody who had a lot of money, and then, sadly these days that's a story we're hearing a lot of, loses it all overnight. Somebody invested with Bernie Madoff, and then it's all gone. In fact, 2 years ago I was in Florida staying with friends. Of course, Florida is where many, many Jews go to retire, and they've had a professional life. They've built businesses, they have their money, they go there. This shul, which my friend was a member of, every single person there was a millionaire. And then after the Madoff thing was announced, the next week they were going around collecting funds for half of the membership who no longer had food for Shabbos. So I want you to imagine that. That, says the Rambam, is the first level of suffering, right? Financial suffering. Somebody had huge amounts of money and it's all gone. The next level of suffering, and you'll see that we're turning up the heat, is health. Somebody was healthy and vibrant, strong, and then suddenly they have a heart attack or some other huge health crisis which occurs to them, and they've lost their health. That's the second stage. Then the third stage, and again it's getting worse, the third stage is what the Rambam calls vicarious suffering. Vicarious suffering is when you suffer for somebody else. Somebody who you love, and somebody who's in great pain. My late wife, Alaiha Shalom, who died after 5 years of breast cancer, often used to say, "This is much worse for you." I actually don't think that was, but often it is. To make it easier, imagine parents suffering for a child who's sick. It's very easy, I would guess, for us to imagine some parents watching a little boy or a little girl being wheeled in a gurney into an operating theatre and praying with absolute sincerity, perhaps more sincerely than they've ever prayed before to God, and saying, "Let it be me. Give it to me." Vicarious suffering. And then the fourth level of suffering, says Maimonides, no suffering. No suffering. So let's see if we can unravel this mystery. Let's go to the first example. I want you to imagine somebody who had huge amounts of money, loses it all, every single penny. In fact, in Chicago, about 7 years ago, in the winter time when I was lecturing there, I was walking along the street, and a guy came up to me, a guy I would say in his 50s, and he said, "Rabbi, can you give me $10 for my medications?" I said, "Sure." So I went into my back pocket and I gave him a $10 bill. He said, "Thank you, Rabbi." And then he said, "And do you know if there's a Chabad house nearby, I need a meal?" I said, "Look, I'm from out of town, but actually I think I saw just 2 blocks back a Chabad house, maybe we'll get a meal there." He said, "Thank you." I started to walk away from him, he started to walk away from me, and he shouted, "Rabbi!" And I turned around and he said, "I want you to know I used to be a millionaire." Now, I assume he's telling me the truth. I mean, if he was trying to make me feel greater sympathy for him, he would have told me that before I gave him the $10. He asked for $10, I gave him $10, not 5. I think he was telling the truth. In fact, where I get my haircut, my barber shop in Manchester, in Northern England, when I get my haircut there's a guy who, the first time I saw him coming in, he came in, the elbows were coming out of his pullover, he had a little dog in a string. He chatted for a few minutes and went out the shop, the barber shop, and my barber said he used to drive a Rolls Royce. There are some people who had huge wealth and it's all gone. So I would like you to think for a second, what negative reactions might a person have to having had huge wealth and suddenly having nothing? Well, of course, there would be depression. There could be anger with God, anger with yourself, anger with your friend who told you to invest in this really unbelievable place called Bernie Madoff Associates. And also there could be a lack of self-esteem. You don't believe in yourself anymore. It's not a coincidence, incidentally, that the buildings on Wall Street all have windows that do not open. You remember the crash in the beginning of the 20th century, 1920s was it? When people literally threw themselves out of the building in Wall Street. They couldn't deal with it anymore. So somebody who loses all their money, so sometimes as far as they're concerned, that's their life. But here's an interesting question. Tell me of positive reactions you could imagine somebody have, or having lost all their money. Positive reactions. Positive reactions? Oh yes. Because you see, if you lose all your money, It could be that your reaction is that you are humbled in a positive sense. It's not something which is tearing you down. You rediscover yourself. You discover the important things in life. As four lads from Liverpool once said in the song, the best things in life indeed are free. It might give you an opportunity to connect with people that you never noticed before as you've been driving along in your chauffeur-driven limousine. I remember once I was lecturing in South Africa in Cape Town for a rabbi who went on to become one of my closest friends, incidentally. It's called Ivan Lerner. He now lives in the United States, near Washington, D.C. And he insisted that as I was flying a 14-hour flight that I was going to be going business class. Let me pause for a second and give you a sincere piece of advice. Never, ever fly business class. Unless you can do it all the time, never ever fly business class. You'll never want to go back to sardine class again. It was unbelievable. I loved it. It was in a jumbo jet, and we first class boys, there's that bumpy bit at the top. That's where we were. There's a ledge. There's a ledge just along the side of the seats where a rabbi can place his hat without it getting squished. And every 5 minutes there's a guy saying, "Can I get you a drink, sir?" I said, "Yes." And I wasn't interested in the drinks. I just loved being served. I had a tray of about 400 of them beside me. It was wonderful. And I remember when I flew back into Heathrow in London, we taxied to the stand, and it was raining outside, and you're very, very high up. And I remember looking out as the baggage handlers came out to take the bags and thinking, "Hello, little people. What's it like down there?" It's very seductive. You aren't in touch with the realities of life. And very rich people tend to be very, very busy people. Losing it all might mean that you'll reprioritize. And you'll also maybe discover who your true friends are. I have a son whose best friend, or one of his best friends, is the son of the richest man in the UK, richest Jew in the UK. His personal portfolio is £1 billion. Pounds, not dollars, pounds, the big ones. And he said to me, I don't know who my friends are. Who are my real friends? Are people being friendly towards me because they want to use me as an entree to my father? He doesn't know. So there could be a whole lot of negative reactions to losing your money and a whole lot of positive reactions to losing all your money. Who'll choose which one it is? You will. Now imagine somebody was healthy and vibrant and strong and then loses their health overnight. Tell me the negative reactions to losing your health, or think of those. And those are much more dramatic than the previous ones. Yes, there will be the anger with yourself. Why didn't I exercise more perhaps? Or anger with God. But it will be fear. Every twinge that you have, is this another heart attack? And your connection with the world, you're hanging by a thread psychologically, the damage and the depression, all sorts of terrible negative reactions a person could have to having lost their health. But what about the positive reactions? Tell me positive reactions to losing, or think of positive reactions to losing your health. Well, I've a very good friend who writes for Ahmadiyya newspaper. It's called Jonathan Rosenblum. He writes for various other newspapers. Sometimes we share columns together. And Jonathan told me a true story that happened in the United States of America about 6 years ago. There was a Jewish woman who was in there in the hospital because she'd had a heart attack. And there was a doctor, a Jewish doctor, by coincidence it was called Rubinstein, who was walking along the corridor and he saw flashing red lights. There was obviously an emergency, a medical emergency in the room. And doctors and nurses were running in and out. And he started to move towards this room. By the time he got there, the woman was lying there. They were switching off the defibrillator. And he said what had happened. She had a massive heart attack. He asked them, had they tried this? Had they tried the other things? They tried everything. He said, "Do you mind if I try?" The doctor said, I don't mind, but there's no point. So they switched the defibrillator back on. They put the paddles to the woman's chest. And they fired a huge amount of electricity through her chest. You may have seen this in documentaries. The body jumps up. Nothing. Fired another time. Nothing. Boom. Still nothing. Boom, boom, boom. Still nothing. He was about to give up. He said, "I'll try it one more time." And then suddenly, beep, 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 beep. The next day, this doctor went to see this woman. And he walked into her room, And her husband was sitting beside her bed, and he leapt up. He said, "That's him! That's the doctor who wouldn't give up." And the woman said, "I'm not going to thank you, Dr. Rubinstein. I'm not going to thank you. But when I go home and I wake up in my own bed for the first time, and I hear the birds singing in that branch that's just outside my window, I'm going to say, thank you, Dr. Rubinstein. When I'm able to take my little girl in my arms and give her a hug, I'm going to say, thank you, Dr. Rubinstein. And when I'm able to take her to school in the morning and bring her home, I'm going to say, thank you, Dr. Rubinstein." Very, very often, you can have, from a result of serious health crises, a different perspective. And I remember when my late wife, Sean, was diagnosed with breast cancer for the first time. And if you've ever been in a serious illness yourself, or with somebody whom you love who's very seriously ill, you'll know that you see the world in a totally different way, from a totally different perspective. I was walking home through a religious Jewish area. There was a young Haredi young man with a toddler in his arms in the doorway of his house, and he was shouting at his wife. They were having an argument. I don't know what the argument was about. But I remember thinking, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. When you're seeing the world through the lens of illness, you see that the vast majority of things that we concern ourselves with, that we aim for, that we worry about, are total and utter garbage. I would say 95%. Have you decided to buy the new iPad? Or maybe you want the new iPhone? We must have it. Who cares? So there'll be a whole load of positives and a whole load of negatives to losing health. Who chooses which way it is? You do. And then there was that very dramatic one. The very dramatic one is, of course, that somebody has a sick child. Think of the negative reactions a person could have to having a child who's very seriously ill. It could be physical illness, or it could be psychological illness. Maybe you're born with an autistic child or a Down syndrome child. What negative reactions could you have to having a child like that? Well, all the ones I mentioned before, the depression, the anger, the fear, the shame, the embarrassment, but much more dramatic. You could reject your partner. If the cause of the disease was a genetic component which only one side carried, then the husband could blame the wife. In fact, people have come to me for advice on this. The wife could blame the husband. She might think, if I hadn't married him, I would have normal children. You might reject each other. You might reject the child. In fact, 30 years ago, the Jewish Observer magazine, excellent magazine, and very brave, I think, published a whole article. The whole magazine was devoted to the fact that ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York City, Hasidim, etc., were quietly disposing of their Down syndrome children to Catholic families to bring up. We had no Down syndrome children in the ultra-Orthodox world, or rather, we didn't want people to know we had, so we disposed of them. You might reject each other, you might reject the child. But what positive reactions might you have to having had a child who's very seriously ill, either psychologically or physically? Well, it may draw you closer to each other than any couple would ever become under normal circumstances. It might draw you closer to that child than any parent would ever come close to their own child, to a normal child, to a healthy child. And it's hardly a coincidence that, I think, probably without exception, the charities that have been set up to deal with childhood illnesses are almost exclusively set up by parents whose children have suffered those childhood illnesses. So there can be a whole load of negative reactions to having a sick kid, or a whole load of positive reactions to having a sick kid. Who chooses which way it is? You will. But then there's that enigma at the end of what the Rambam says. The fourth level of suffering, the worst level of suffering, no suffering. No suffering. The explanation goes like this. Every single one of us, me talking to you, you listening to me, every single person on the planet is born with certain strengths and certain weaknesses. Our job here is to promote the strengths and to diminish and eventually discard the weaknesses. And generally, societally, we're helped by that. Our parents help us with that. Our social group helps us with that. After all, if you go to school and you won't share the gifts that you've been given, if you come with candies and you won't share the candies, then you're not going to become popular. Society imposes certain behaviour on you that makes you acceptable, makes you a worthy member of the group. But some people don't. Some people never get beyond themselves, beyond the I, and do a tremendous amount of damage as a consequence of that. So it might be that if God sees that you can't generate change from within, then it might be in order to help you change and to stop you damaging other people. They will give you events that could cause you to change from without. You might have a period where you lose a lot of money. You might have a period where you lose health. You might need a stronger medicine where you suffer for somebody whom you love. And we all agreed, just rewind the tape, we all agreed that these choices could be either positive or negative, and you chose which one it is. But if you've no suffering in life, and if you remember, as we said at the beginning of this lecture, I've never come across anybody who hasn't, but if you went through life with no suffering, it could be. It could be. The explanation is simply they know in heaven that you were right off. There's no point in giving such a person any suffering in order to allow him the opportunity to change, because he or she is not changing under any circumstance. So what's the point in making them suffer here? God doesn't punish people just for the fun of it. It's to evoke a change, to allow them to grow. And if they won't, give them an easy life, because they're relinquishing the next one. So the choices are dramatic often, but I have to tell you that the crises that we face need not, must not, ever sell themselves to you or allow you allow them to tell you that they are unbeatable. I want to tell you one of the two most important things I think I teach, and I've got thousands of lectures. But somebody called Rabbi Dessler, he says that the Hebrew word for evil or bad is ra, resh, ayin. And Rabbi Dessler says, what's the opposite of ra? To which everybody says, tov, good. Rabbi Dessler says something brilliant. He says the opposite of resh, ayin is ayin, resh. Resh, ayin, resh. What does the word ayin, resh mean in Hebrew? And that word air means a catalyst or an awakening. And it's certainly true. We know this statistically, that alcoholics go on to produce another generation of alcoholics. Bullies were bullied. Sexual abusers were abused. But it doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be like that. The opposite of Ra can be air, a catalyst and awakening. And Rabbi Dessler secures this with 4 examples. He points out in the Haggadah, that we read at Pesach time, of course, it talks about at the beginning our forefathers were idolaters. Terach, Avi Avram, the father of Avram. That's strange. We know the Jewish people start from Avram, so why do we trace our lineage back to a generation which isn't Jewish, to Terach? Or the Jewish people themselves, in preparation for being able to stand at Mount Sinai, to become the chosen people, a people who are going to carry a message of ethics and morality and monotheism through the millennia. Where did God take us as a preparation? Did he take us to some Bnei Brak, to Yerushalayim? No. He took us to a place called Egypt, a bloody exile, where Pharaoh slaughtered 2,000 Jewish babies every morning and 2,000 Jewish babies every evening to bathe in their blood as a cure for his leprosy. And incidentally, if you think that's a very strange idea, the last dictator, communist dictator of Europe who fell was a fellow called Ceausescu, the Romanian dictator. They discovered after he fell that he ordered his doctor every morning to give him injections of baby's blood because he thought it would keep him looking young. And how about the greatest Jew who ever lived? He was called Moses, yes? Where did he have his education? Where did he have his upbringing? Was it in some school run by Satmar or Vishnitz? No. He was brought up in Pharaoh's palace and bounced on his knee, and Pharaoh believed himself to be a god. And the last example is the story of Ruth. Ruth is the mother of the Mashiach, King David's grandmother, and eventually the Messianic line flows through her. Where did she come from? She came from a country, from a nation called Moab. The rabbis say Moab was the most repulsive of all the nations. Their inception was incest, Lot and his daughters, but they boasted of it. Moab, from my father. Normally when incest occurs, it's such a shameful thing, nobody wants to talk about it. They boasted of it. If God is looking for a woman to carry the seed of the Messiah in her womb, couldn't he have found a nice Jewish girl from Williamsburg or Muncie? You had to go to Moab. And Rabbi Desta says that the answer to all these four riddles is in this strange Hebrew word ra, and its opposite, er, not tov. It is specifically and precisely because Abram had a father who was called Terach that he went in the opposite direction. Terach was an idolater. Terach was the guy who sold idols. Abram saw the bankruptcy of that and went in the opposite direction and could become the monotheist. It was because the Jewish people had that bloody exile in Egypt and they saw the bankruptcy of Egyptian society that they would go in the opposite direction and stand at a mountain called Sinai and make a different choice. It was because Moses was brought up and bounced in the lap of a man who thought he was a god that he would go in the opposite direction and seek out and find the real God. And it's because Ruth came from a sexually and morally bankrupt society called Moab that she became the paradigm of female sexual modesty. Remember the story when she picks up the wheat which has been dropped by the harvesters in the field? How does she do this? Well, as any woman knows, when you're wearing a skirt, I should incidentally include Scotsman as well, but when you're wearing a skirt and you bend from the waist, that causes the hem to move higher up, revealing leg. Well, she didn't bend down like that. She literally crouched down, so she sat on her heels. That caused her skirts to fall about her legs, covering completely her legs. Where did she get that from? She came from Moab. Because she came from Moab. It is true that alcoholics produce alcoholics, and bullies produce bullies, and abusers produce abusers. But it doesn't have to be like that. The opposite of Ra can be air. A number of years ago, I was in San Diego. And I was speaking at there's two Orthodox shows there. I was sitting at the front, the rabbi had a chair to the left of the Orna Kodesh. I was sitting in a chair to the right. And it was a nice, friendly congregation indeed. I don't know if you've ever seen a face that you just take an instant liking to. There was an old fellow there, sitting over there in the show. And he was carrying his age heavily. He was obviously in his 80s. But he had a sparkle in his blue eyes, and he had a lovely smile. He looked over and smiled at me, and I liked him. I smiled at him too. And the next day, I gave a talk. Now, I gave 3 talks over the Shabbaton. What happens when I'm doing lecture tours, you supply a list of titles to your host, organization, or rabbi, and they choose. And they'd chosen this one, this topic here. And so I gave this lecture. Afterwards, we sat down in the hall for a meal, and the old fellow with the sparkling blue eyes and the gorgeous smile came up and sat down beside me. And he said to me, Rabbi, I want you to know that everything you said about suffering was 100% correct. I was in 14 concentration camps, including Auschwitz, which is where I got this. And he held up to his left hand 3 of the fingers had been chopped off by an SS man who had taken his hand and stuck it into a chopping machine in a factory. And we chatted a little bit more, and off he went to sit at his table. And then another guy came up to me. This guy was younger, had more of an American accent. He lives in Detroit, but he winters in San Diego, which has got a beautiful, lovely climate. And he said to me, Rabbi, I want you to know that I'm speaking this afternoon at Suda Shlishis. You've taken away everything I wanted to say. I was in Auschwitz, but I wanted to hear what a survivor of Auschwitz would have to say on the subject of suffering. There was 400 people in the room that afternoon when he spoke, and he said the following thing. One day, a bunch of us boys were standing at a corner of the barracks within sight of the chimneys of the crematorium. And one of the guys says to us, I'm happy I'm in Auschwitz. We said, what? He said, I'm happy I'm in Auschwitz. We said, you're happy you're in Auschwitz? Are you crazy? You're sick? You're sugar? And he said, no, I'm not sugar. And if I wasn't happy, so where should I be? Still in Auschwitz. When I heard those words, I realized I was hearing words which were much bigger than any words I'd ever heard before. And the speaker went on and said the following thing. He says, you know, it says in the Torah that Yaakov fought with the angel. After he fought with the angel, he goes to a place called Sholem, a city called Sholem. Here's the pasuk. It's in Bereshis, it's in Lamed Gimel, pasuk Yud Aleph, 33, verse 11. Vayarba Yaakov Sholem, Yishken. Now the English translation, check it out anywhere. And Yaakov came to Sholem, the city of Shechem. There was a city called Sholem. But the Hebrew doesn't support that English translation. Because then it should say, Vayarba Yaakov El Sholem, or Vayarba Yaakov Shlema, Ir Shechem. But it doesn't. It says Vayarba Yaakov Sholem. So all the rabbis turn around and say, no. You know what? When he got there, he was Sholem. Sholem means perfect. And something called the Gera Rabbi, Sfasem, says, no, that doesn't make sense. He's just fought with the angel, and the Torah itself tells us, he was physically hurt as a consequence, and he limped, so he wasn't Sholem, he wasn't perfect. And the Sfasem says, no. It was precisely and specifically because of all the suffering he'd had in his life that brought him to Shlemut, brought him to be Sholem, perfect. Just as we said before, suffering sometimes brings you to greatness. And then this speaker turned round and he said to his audience, in the Gemara, it tells a story about somebody called Nochem Ish Gamzu. Whatever happened to Nochem Ish Gamzu, he used to say, Gamzu Latoivo, this will also be good. And then he paused. He said, do you know how you read that Gemara? Gamzu Latoivo. This I'll make good. And then he paused, he scanned the 400 faces, and he said, and if you haven't suffered, you haven't lived. If you haven't suffered, you're nothing. Because how else are you going to help other people when they're suffering? But when you go through tough times, you can make the choice negative or positive. You can grow from it. You can become great from it. But you don't have to become great alone. You don't have to fight the disaster and overcome the crisis alone. Things Jews have always been very good at doing is asking advice. Before counseling and psychology became a major multi-billion-dollar industry, Jews have been good at asking advice. And that's the other important thing I teach. Ask the Rav. You need a mentor, you need a guide. If you're a woman, that might be ask the Rav, it sounds more appropriate. Somebody who can help you overcome a crisis. Nobody sees themselves objectively. And when you're hurting a lot, chances are you won't see where the light at the end of the tunnel lies. You need guidance. But from difficult times, from crisis, you can achieve greatness. And if you can't see how to achieve it yourself, make sure you get to somebody who's wise, with a good track record, who's there to help you, not for themselves, and help them get you to overcome the worst of times and achieve greatness.